sitting down, we'll get started. What I want to do today is present some thoughts. This is not going to teach you how to deal with difficult families. We'll get to that at the end of the course. What I do want to do is to help you to identify when you're dealing with a family that you need to think about whether the usual tools are useful, or whether you need to think about something else. And something else is not something that's possible to learn about how to do today. So I'm going to talk about half an hour, and then we're going to do a longer time for you to work on yourselves as therapists. You're going to be using this slide, remember it, from last time. In other words, when did I feel about myself or about somebody in the family? That's the way you identify when there's been induction into the system. Systems that are lower differentiation, the induction is stronger, and oftentimes you don't notice it. So you'll be using this slide, and one more slide that I'll show you at the end. Now, there's a little bit of thinking, actually there's a fair bit of thinking that goes into what to do with these families. And so stay with me, and if you have clinical questions, reserve them for doing the exercise and talking about the exercise, because I want to get through the thinking part of it. It's a very important part. You see, what you learn when you deal with most difficult families, you learn something about how you are with the other families too, and the division of function between the family and the therapist. As you know, some families heal themselves. They come in, you listen to them, and they say, well, thank you very much, that was marvelous. And you say, well, you're welcome, but I will, you see, guys seem to have done all the work. And there are some families where no matter what you do, it doesn't seem to touch them. And those are the ones that we're trying to understand in this series. Now, the important name that opened this way of thinking was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst in Milano in the late 60s and early 70s. Her name was Maura Salvini Palazzoli, and she started with families with anorexia, and then she went on to families with schizophrenia, and she created a different way of thinking about these families, which became crucial for about 30 years, and then disappeared everywhere except in this classroom. And I don't think it was a good thing that it disappeared, so we're keeping it alive, because you know what happens sometimes in the therapy world is it's a good idea, it's not clear how to integrate it, it's kind of fritters away. Next year somebody will reinvent this in some other way. I discovered Salvini Palazzoli after all the central book that she wrote was in 78. That already is a long time ago. And so we're right for somebody to rediscover it. So you're sort of behind the times and ahead of the times, because times are circular. And actually what we're talking about is circularity. When Salvini Palazzoli tried to summarize in an article, what exactly does the therapist do? We're talking about all the families, but it's more conscious, it's more delineated when you're dealing with difficult families. She's proposed the following, which you see you can understand as starting with the I and the you and the relationship of I-you. She said the first thing that a therapist is always doing is hypothesizing. Hypothesizing means that's what's going on in our heads. How much you say it out loud, that's a technical question. But when a family comes in and you say to yourself, what is the trouble? And you immediately start to think, it's not just the trouble, where's the movement? And where's the difficulty in the movement? How is this family trying to grow? And how is the family having difficulty in growing? How scared to death is the family to grow? What are the possibilities for growing? And since we learned about time, so you'll be saying, and what's happening now? What is the family life cycle that's happening that's creating this. So you're always thinking about it. That's our role. You begin by thinking about what might be happening. It's always better if you have a co-therapist. That's out of style now because it's not financially so feasible, but it's always easier to hypothesize when there's two people in the room. Family therapy didn't start with one person in the room. With Whitaker it did, but aside from a few exceptions, a lot of times people saw families together, so there were two people who were able to hypothesize together. But that's what supervision is for too. The second part of thinking about the family is what's called circularity. And I started to hint at that when we talked about what are called circular questions. You say to yourself not, what is the X that causes Y, but how does X feed into Y that then gets back to X? What kind of a cycle is going on in the family that reinforces itself? What is the way that, see, the child doesn't go to school. So you can say, okay, well, it's either the school or the family or the kid, right? Those are the causes. Or you say to yourself, how does this work in a circle? You find out how something works in a circle by saying when he doesn't go to school, who talks to whom about it? Remember we talked about that? That's looking at, okay, and then he goes back, and then he talks to his aunt, and his aunt was recently widowed and hasn't much to do, and so she's kind of adopting him, and then that changes her relationship with his mother, and so forth, and it goes into a circle. It works in a certain way, which is dysfunctional only in one section. The symptomatic part is dysfunctional. If you recall when we talked about symptoms, we said that that's what a symptom is for, to make reality not work. Because everything else is, as they say in Israel, sababa. Everything else is fine. So you see the kid doesn't go to school, and the family is overall better off, except for the fact that he doesn't go to school, right? But how is the family better off? That's the circular part. And the third part of it, which is crucial, is the word neutrality. Now, when Silvini Bellazzoli and her group of senior psychoanalysts wrote about neutrality, they meant the following. They meant that you understand deeply what it's like to be that child, and no less deeply what it's like to be his sister, and no less deeply what it's like to be his father, and no less deeply what it's like to be his mother, and his grandmother, and so forth. So neutrality doesn't mean you don't really care. It's not a sense of this doesn't matter to me. It's a deep neutrality. What it means is that, when I've understood that this kid is really angry at his father, but I don't make that exclusive. I say to myself, I can understand how angry he is with his father, and I need to know what it's like to be his father, right? No less so. That's neutrality. In other words, you move from one station to the other in a deeply involved way. But you have to have wheels under your feet. You have to be able to deeply connect with each person, but no more than any other person. When you start to be connected more to one side than to another side, that's where you get inducted into the system, right? That's you become on his side or on his mother's side against the father, and then you say to yourself, wait a minute, I probably haven't understood deeply enough another situation. So you see that the original article goes from I to you. In other words, how am I thinking? What are you doing? And the relationships between you. Now, that was an interesting way of looking at it. The group included 4 psychoanalysts, and like all groups, it didn't last forever. After about 20 years of creating an enormous contribution, the group split up, and Mara Silvini Bellazzoli and the other woman in the group went into research. And Bosco Sechin and the other man became more of the clinical part of it. And Sechin and his cohort wrote the article over again. And the interesting thing about the article that they refer to is that it starts with curiosity. Curiosity hypothesizing, and circularity, right? Now you see what happened to neutrality? Neutrality turned into curiosity. It's a good shift, linguistically, because neutrality has this unfortunate meaning of not really caring that much. And that is not at all what we're talking about. The deeper the pathology, the less differentiated the family, the more deeply you have to allow yourself to be inducted and not inducted, inducted and not inducted. You have to get into seeing how it's impossible in 7 or 8 different ways. So what the next group suggested was that the issue is, first of all, to start with curiosity. Now, curiosity means, see, hypothesizing begins with, I'm thinking, right? In other words, what do I know? Curiosity begins with what I don't know. And that was an improvement. And a lot of times, these sorts of ways of looking at things improve. Curiosity is meant in a deep and positive way. As you know, curiosity can also mean just an interest in sort of peeking behind. And in Israel, for some reason, the word in Hebrew for curiosity is sakranut. And somebody who's curious is a sakran. Spoken Israeli culture, it's a negative term. It's a term that refers to people who are sort of, you know the term rubbernecking? Anybody know the term rubbernecking? There's an accent, it's a marvelous term. I don't know if it's from New England or it's from everywhere. But there's an accident and everybody's looking at the accident, and so they're busy looking. What are they doing? They're messing up traffic for an hour because they need to have a look. That's the negative side of curiosity. That's not the curiosity that we're talking about. In English, curiosity is still considered rather positive. That's the kind of curiosity we're talking about. If you hear in the news that there's, a big cock on Route 1 because there's a small accident, call us sakranim, all the people who need to, it's rubberneckers. Is that true? Rubbernecking is true? Is that a term used all over America? Familiar to everybody? It's not familiar. There's no way to translate it, right? Anyway, so you start with curiosity. One of the reasons they changed the term was because, as we'll see as we get to it very soon, when they wrote the first paper on neutrality, hypothesizing circularity and neutrality, one of the greats of family therapy in America blew a gasket. And the person who blew a gasket was Salvador Minuchin, whose way of looking at, remember the structure of that? Minuchin was deeply involved. He was, first of all, a showman, and second of all, he was a real mensch. So when Minuchin would see a family, he would get very engaged with them. He would get very engaged with them. But he was succeeding with families at a higher level of differentiation. And he didn't see the difference. So with families that gave him the role, we'll see about the roles in a minute, he could be deeply involved. So he saw that the Italians were saying neutrality, and he blew a gasket. I happened to have been at that lecture. It was around 79 or so. And he was a very kind man. Family therapists usually sort of generous with each other. He said, look, I love all of my colleagues except those crazy people in Italy. How can you be neutral? How can you be neutral? What happened? He didn't understand that they meant neutral, meaning involved with wheels under your involvement. He thought it meant that they're not involved at all. But how you get involved has to do with, it wasn't just that Minuchin blew a gasket, that's just a, Bürgermeister. It was a deep kind of gasket, because family therapists are always wondering how deeply they're involved and how less deeply they're involved. In other words, how you were able to keep your mind free when everybody's telling you this deep story. It's just that all the stories are different. So when all the stories are very different, you need the wheels underneath, right? If all the stories are not so different, in other words, differentiation is not so low, so you can allow yourself to be, the master of the family and be deeply involved, and they won't eat you alive. They won't swallow you into the family system. So when Minuchin said neutrality is a bad idea, he was talking about different families. Anyway, section, you see, starts with what I don't know. And that's highly recommended to you folks. That after you learn this whole year-long course about what you do know, when the family comes in, the first thing you ask yourself is what I don't know. You begin with this. If it doesn't make me curious, I'm not doing my role. And that's true, for example, when the mother comes in and says, you know, he was doing fine, and this year he has this teacher that he doesn't like so much, and so he stopped going to school and we can't get him back. So there it is, right? So you know everything. The mother has to, maybe the kid is saying, yeah. So if you start with hypothesizing, you're pretty much done, because the family is feeding you with hypothesis. It's a good idea to start with curiosity and say, the family apparently needs this explanation. It works in the way for the family, but there might be some other things that the family is not seeing that would not be repressed unconscious, that would be group unconscious, non-conscious, what we talked about, that they're not seeing. And they're saying, you know, because you say to yourself, lots of kids have lots of teachers that they don't like. Not every kid who has a teacher he doesn't like stops going to school and the kid can't get him back. And so you might start to think, then you can start to hypothesize about what else might be happening. And you can say, well, let's just sort of have a broader look at the family and what other things are happening. Well, you know, he's an adolescent, you know, this isn't so important. The mother says, but my mother is in the hospital for the last 6 months with a terminal illness, and the family doesn't want to see the connection, you see. But when you find out that the kid stays home from school and picks up all the slack from the mother with the younger kids when he's home, then you say to yourself, well, he couldn't very well say to his mother, listen, I see that you're overwhelmed, I'm going to pick up the slack, and I'm not going to go to school in order to pick up the slack, right? So he can't say that, but he can say this teacher is just awful and I just can't stand it. And then he stays home. But what does he do at home? He picks up the slack with the younger kids. So now we're starting with curiosity. We didn't take the simple explanation as true. We began to hypothesize something else, and then we have circularity, which is, and then when he picks up the slack, what happens? Well, you know, I can spend an extra hour with my mother, and so forth. Then you talk about her relationship with the mother, and then you see what I mean? That if you go straight in to say, well, let's talk to that teacher, because you know the teacher is the issue, we're going to end up without curiosity. We'll start hypothesizing before we're ready to. Okay, it's an important point. Yeah.
Is neutrality still part of the formula, or is it completely taken out?
In the second article, they replaced neutrality with curiosity and began with curiosity. Is it take it out? No, it's part of what people experience, but this is an improved way of looking at it. If you're curious, you have to be neutral, because you can't be seeing one side, only one side. You just.
So if you, let's say, you're seeing a client, she's sharing, you know, a story about her father and mother, like you have these negative feelings towards her father.
I missed the last part.
So let's say like I have a client who's telling me about her parents, and like all the time I found myself really disliking her father.
Right.
Is that non-neutrality?
Correct. Right.
So the minute you're having a reaction.
See, whenever you see an adolescent, it's very hard to be neutral, because the adolescent doesn't want you to be neutral. He wants you to take a side, and you may need to have him feel that you're taking his side deeply. That's not neutral, right? But not only his side. And the more that an adolescent feels that you're taking his side deeply, that you're seeing it from inside, the more he will allow you to say, I wonder what it's like to be your father right now, and so forth. Okay, I want to go on, because you know we'll get to this slide, we won't get to the rest, and I want you to do a long exercise. So let's defer the questions, because hopefully you'll work on them. Is this part clear? This is a piece of family therapy that was absolutely central to understanding families for 30 years, and it's disappeared, but I don't think it's a good idea that it should disappear, because with it, families that are deeply in trouble also disappeared from the map. So now, when you say that the therapist is part of the therapeutic system, right? You see, you would like to say, it's the family. And I'm just helping the family, but you know, I'm not part of the family. And what we need to realize in all therapies, but certainly in family therapy, is that there's a system called the family plus therapist system. That's a new system, right? And that new system, guess what? The most important part of that new system is that its differentiation is at a higher level than the family's differentiation. That's what pulls the family to higher differentiation. What happens in the room has a higher level of differentiation. Well, who's supposed to pull for the higher level of differentiation? The family's the same family. They come in, they go out. So who pulls for the differentiation? That's our role. One of our roles is to preserve our own differentiation. See how that fits with what we just talked about? If we get inducted into the system, we're not doing anything new, right? But if we can move around, then we're able to be curious, which the family has not yet been, and we're able to preserve our own role in curiosity, hypothesizing, and understanding circularity. So this is connected to, does everybody know Heisenberg's uncertainty principle? Okay. Well, a brief point of nuclear physics. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is a mathematical principle. People tend to state it as if it's an observational principle. It can't be observational, and you'll see why in a minute. But if you look at it as if it's observational, because we're not going to do the math, not because you can't do it, because I can't do it, it looks like this. Let's say you want to know where an electron is, right? So how are you going to find out where an electron is at any given split tiny piece of a second? You're going to have to look at it in some way. So you're going to look at it with a beam of light, because that's how we look at things. Oh, but when I look at it with the beam of light, it moves, right? The beam of light moves it. So I can't possibly know where it is. Now, the principle is that you can't know where it is and its velocity. Those two things are unknowable at the same time. You can know where it is, or you can know its velocity, but you can't know both. Because when you're looking at where it is, you've changed its velocity, right? If you try to calculate its velocity, you have to assume that you don't know where it is. So Heisenberg's uncertainty principle was a very important part of 20th century thinking. And as you probably know, physics had an enormous effect, nuclear physics, had an enormous effect on how Western people think about the world in the 20th century. If anything had an effect, it was Heisenberg and relativity. We began to think of things as less knowable and more as how do we interact with them. In other words, we're in the game together with the client, right? The new system, we're influencing the system. There isn't a way to pull back and say, let's just take a look at your family. The moment you say that, let's take a look at the family, the family doesn't take a look at itself usually. So now the family's taking a look, it's just a different family, right? So any moment, see, Freud had this idea, which was a brilliant idea 420 years ago, which was that, you can freeze things. You can freeze things, and his main metaphor was archaeology, and as a physician, he was a great histologist. Histologist is when you take a cell and kill it, put it into wax, cut it up into small sections, and look at the dead cell, the structure of the dead cell. He wasn't so good in physiology. Physiology is when you take a cell and kick it and see which way it goes, right? He had a teacher named Bricker, where it means bridge, and he didn't do so well with Bricker. He was a better histologist. Now, there are those among us who are histologists, and there are those among us who are physiologists. In other words, some of us would like to freeze things and look at it, and some of us would like to give it a kick and see where it goes. In therapy, you're always doing both, right? That's why I'm telling you about this. You don't need to know whether Freud was a histologist or a physiologist. That's not required for family therapists. But some of us want to say, would you guys just stop? Freeze, let me take a look at you. And then you say to yourself, wait a minute, but I'm influencing them by saying stop. That's a new role. So when they're stopping, they're not really stopping. You can't really stop things. So then what do I have to do? I have to figure out what my role is and dance with the family. It's an interactive part. That's what's important about our role. So, you see, now we have a question of how do I create my role? What roles do I offer and how do I create them? And how do I stay with my role? Because that's where my differentiation is. That's what preserves the higher differentiation of the system of me and the family, as opposed to the family without me. Okay? And the last thing, which is awfully important and is completely missing in family therapy literature, some of you probably learned this in your MA. People familiar with Winnicott? I think maybe you learned some of it with Barbara. Winnicott had a very deep theory of play. He thought that play wasn't what you do in your spare time when you're not doing something serious. He thought play is what you do when you're being human. And some of the time you learn stuff. Play is what you do when you're being human. And what play is a place where you don't ask the question, is this real or imaginary? You familiar with that? That's what's called the transitional zone. I'll just go over it in a second. You know, the baby at 6 or 8 months takes a wet rag, and when mother leaves the room, the baby uses the rag as if it's mother, right? And so you say to yourself, listen, kid, get it right. Is this rag, that's reality, or is it mother, which is a fantasy? Mother's not here now. I'm looking for mother. So it's standing in for mother. It only works when you don't ask the question, is it reality or fantasy? The moment you ask the question, you're not in the transitional zone. The transitional zone is a place where we live, where we don't ask the question. And, you know, a great deal of literature. For those of you who watch movies and say to yourself, well, there is this movie that I watched 4 times. The world's record, I think, is 98. There's one film that I gave a lecture on, and I went into the internet to find out, and some lady had seen this film 98 times. Well, what was different? Or, you know, listen, lahavdil al-fehavdallah, but you know what the Gemara says about a sugya, right? So 101st time is just so different from 100. So how is it different? It's not exactly, the words are different. It's something that's interactive. It's something where there's something playful that allows you to allow the pieces to fall in a different way. Now, in families, in some basic way, a family therapist needs to be able to be playful. Why? Because if you're committed only to reality, you're not understanding what the family fantasy is. For example, this kid who's saving his mother to be with grandma, is that reality or fantasy? Well, if you ask, it's not the world's best planned reality, but it works awfully well in fantasy. So it's important for the family therapist to be able to preserve in the role that they take some kind of a playful manner. And you'll see this with all of the great family therapists. You'll see it with Whitaker, you'll see it with Virginia Satir, you'll even see it with Venusian, although he'll deny it, because he's, you know, a control freak, and we'll see why in a second. But you'll see it with all of the great family therapists. You have to have an ability to be playful. That's where you put wheels under your role. That's where you say, I'm deeply involved here, but not only here, also here. How do you go from the kid's version to the mother's version? Play is an important part of how you feel. Now, you see, family therapy divided into 2 camps. One was the responsibility camp. Psychoanalysts, they all said after they failed their personal psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis doesn't give you the answers. You've probably heard that these days with, you know, the great Stephen King. The role of the therapist is to give answers. It's irresponsible to just sit there and listen to things. What is the role of the therapist? The patient needs responsibility. You have to use power. The patient comes in and says, what do I do? And you tell them what to do. And the great representatives of those were the misunderstanding of Milton Erickson that Jay Haley created. That you remember the story about the bedwetting? So the lady came in and said, what do I do with my bedwetting? And he spent an hour telling her what to do. So that Haley, who was not so good at play, decided that's a responsible therapist. That's what family therapist should do. He didn't understand the playful part of it. And Minuchin was one of the major...
Erickson understood the playful part.
What's that?
Erickson understood the playful part.
But you see what's going to happen is that Erickson shows up in both places. Erickson was the most curious person possible. So that's why it's important to read Milton Erickson, because it gives you something that combines them. But at the beginning, family therapy was, and it still is, all the foundational problems are always with us forever. Those of you who are familiar with kibbutzim and the way that things work in a kibbutz, you have to go back to who were the three people that were arguing with each other in 1947. And then it just keeps repeating itself. So you need to know in family therapy what are the foundational problems and try to understand them. So there was this debate, it wasn't a debate, it was a fight about power, what's a responsible therapist? And so the Mental Research Institute, that's in Palo Alto, and Manusha and Haley were the great people who said, you want to be a therapist? When the client asks you what to do, tell them. And the other people, so-called other people, were Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson was one of the great systems thinkers of the 20th century. He's mainly known as the man who was married to Margaret Mead, who's much more famous. But and then there's Milano. Milano is the group that we just met, 1 and 2, the 4 and the 2. Lynn Hoffman, the book that you read, you've all read it by now, right? She's an important player in trying to find out what's curiosity and what's responsibility. And to some extent, the NRI people also had an element of play. Somebody else named Randolphi. Now, if you say to yourself, who's right? So then you're being inducted into the fight, right? To this fight in the family therapy, and you're being inducted into who's right. Instead of saying, for the men, you could say, maybe there's a different hechitimtza, right? Maybe we're dealing with different families. Maybe they're correct, but talking about different families. How could we understand where some families need us to say, do this, and where some families need us to pull back and to think with them in a circular way, because telling them to do it doesn't help them, because they don't give us that role. So now, that's where we come to what we started to talk about last time. You see, there are, over here, where the role of the therapist is more easily acquired, well, you could be curious or not curious, it works, right? And over here, where there's a vague and contradictory disqualification, and they don't give you authority or leadership, so do something else. And in the middle, there's this use of force, right? In other words, here's Manushin, and here's Haley, and here's Milano, and here's everybody's go-to position. These are the families I like to treat, the ones who make it easy for me to be a therapist. I can be a good therapist with them. I don't have to think too much about my role. I think with them about their feelings. So one could say, well, some families allowed us to be sort of a tour guide into fantasies and emotions. We love those families. I hope you all have at least 1 or 2. That's what makes you feel like you can do what you're doing. And then there are families who say, look, can you tell us what to do? And you say, well, here's what to do in the room, right? You're sort of an educator or a director on the stage, and you make them do things in the room. You're really being responsible, and it works because they give you that role. Or like the kid with the bedwetting, they say, tell us what to do, and you tell them what to do. So that's a different role, right? That's a role. You say, well, look, lady, bring your husband in and we'll talk about what you disagree about. She said, he's not coming, right? So what did Erickson do? He said, look, I'll give you advice. This is what to do. Why? Because that's the role she gave him. And then we get to these people who need us to protect them, and that's what we started to talk about last time. If we take a look at the level of differentiation, and this is the slide that I want you to use in the workshop that we work together. You see that families with a higher level of differentiation, the level of differentiation of the therapist is easier to acquire. All you need to do is to think like a therapist. I wonder how it works, what are you feeling? You ask the kid, what are you feeling? And the kid says, that's how I'm feeling. Ask my father too. Oh, this is a family that's going to be able to, right? And they said, well, you know, asked the father, he said, that's how I feel. My wife thinks differently. Well, this is, you know, we're in a run. Who's putting us on a run? The family. The level of differentiation is adequate to give us that role. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, and this also connects with me to like what you said about the therapist having wheels and moving it from person to person. Even if you have a family that, let's say, does that, and that's incredible, like this is how I feel asking my father, like what you were saying. What does the therapist do with that though? Because everybody does feel differently, so like...
Right. Well, what the therapist does is what we all do. We do as little as possible.
Okay.
In other words, the family, the wife says, and this is how I feel. And the husband says, oh, I never understood that before. And you see, they haven't talked about it. So the therapist does this amazing intervention and says, how about if the two of you just talk about it? You know? And they say, well, why waste our time here? We can talk about it over coffee. And I said, well, give that a try. Amazing therapist, you know. In other words, you help people to do something, but they're not far from it. You know, sometimes you say to yourself, welcome into the room, and people say, we're here to work. And so just do as little as possible, and let us do as much as possible. Right? So, you see the educator or the role of pushing chairs around and telling people, you know, what to do, those are families with moderate differentiation. They can't yet do the emotional work together. They need to be organized, but when they're organized, and so they give you the role, organize us to do things we haven't done, and then you say, sit here, sit there, you be quiet, and they do it. Now they do it not because the therapist is a genius. Minuchin also wasn't a genius in theory. He was very charismatic. And when he told people to do it, they listened to him. But guess what? They gave him the role. They gave him the role. How do you know that they gave him the role? You know, there's lots of tapes, right, of Minuchin working, and hopefully we'll see some over time. But those tapes were made out of 5% of the patients who came into Philadelphia Child Guidance. The other 95%, he said, look, the whole family has to come in or you're untreatable. So which families came in? Ones that could do this kind of work. In other words, he already started as a director, and that was sort of a test. And according to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, he said, I know how to work in a certain way with certain families. He didn't say that. He said, I know how to work with all families. But this is how you have to work with all families. So 5% of the families pitched up and gave him the role. And the other ones are lost to follow up. We don't know. And anybody who trained in at Minuchin in Philadelphia, as my wife did, saw the tapes of how it works and never saw the people that just kind of disappeared. Where were those people? Some of them might have said to Minuchin, we're not all coming in because that's not your role. We're here for you to tell us what to do, right? And so those people went to Washington to Jay Haley, and Jay Haley was good at that. We saw what's good at it, which is that you make changes simultaneously in 3 in each of the dyads of the central triangle. Remember that? Haley did it unconsciously. He didn't have a theory of differentiation. He thought, so that's what you do with all families. All families come in for the expert to tell you, so where did it work? Where those families were giving him the role, and then it worked just fine because he was very intuitive about how to understand this. But it's a role that they give us. And if they don't give us that role, it doesn't work. And we're talking about the most difficult families, where we talked about the paradox that they come in and say, protect us from change. Now, how would that role help anybody? Well, the answer is, if it's giving you that role, then maybe that's what they need. So you understand deeply why they need to be protected, and say, let's not move too quickly. And that allows them to change. You see, the family is more differentiated. Because before that, the family system with the therapist, before that, the family system says, we're stuck. You know, we're going to all these therapists, and usually the family therapist is the last one, and none of them have helped us, so we're hopeless, right? That's the family system. Family system with the therapist is, you're not hopeless at all. You're doing something very deep, and it takes time to understand it. And in the meantime, don't rush. That allows the family to look different. The differentiation in the family and the therapist system together is true, rather than being totally stuck. I'm going to keep going because I know that I have some stuff to try to cover here. So you see that it's not really a fight, right? In other words, that you'll go from Ackerman or Bowen. Did Ackerman or Bowen say the whole family has to come in? No. Because let's say a couple comes in and the differentiation is high enough, they will generalize their changes to other people. And the use of power is these guys here. It's either power in the session or power outside the session. In the session, you need everybody. Outside of the session, you don't need everybody. Or the counter-paradoxical, the provocative approach, which spends a lot of time thinking about why change would be dangerous. And the therapist takes that role because that's the role they're giving us. If we don't understand it, we start to fight with them. Listen, you have to do what I told you. And the family says, why would we do that? That's pretty dangerous. So if you flip it, then it allows the family to say, you know, maybe we really ought to change. You're not the instrument. And they probably won't say thank you very much. So,
I didn't understand that.
what's that?
I didn't understand this.
The last one, the counter-paradoxical one. The family is...
The one that you just said, when you said it's strategic, you know?
these people that are, you know, your role is to protect them. So...
Why would the family not go on? Because they feel like...
What?
Why would the family not go on? Because they're more differentiated and they don't want someone to tell them what to do, but they have their own dynamic.
They're afraid to change. They're afraid to change. So to tell them what to do is to push them over the cliff. They say, thank you very much, we've already done that a few times. Now, if you think about the role of play, you can see that what do you play with? What does the therapist play with? When we become the guide to the family, we're playing with feelings, fantasies, and thoughts. We're playing with them. How might you feel like this? Who felt like that? And the family joins us. So that's what's called therapy. That's similar to what, you know, the basic things that you learn about what therapy is. If they give you the role. When you're playing the director or the educator, what you're playing with are positions in the family. In other words, you can look at a family group, usually not a very large family group. You look at the family group and say that there's an alliance between the daughter and the mother against the father. And so you say, well, we're going to play with that. We're going to see what it would be like for her to talk to her father and leave her mother out of it, right? So we're going to see how that would work. Some of that is what Whitaker did with Claudia in the session that we analyzed. When you're being the expert, you're not playing with, you know, this relationship or that relationship. You're playing with the symptomatic cycle. You have to think circularly. You have to say, how is this symptom also functional? Remember, how is the symptom both expressing the problem in the family and creating the possibility of change in the family? That's the new part that we think about. We say, oh, you guys, those are your wheels. The wheels is the symptom. Here's how to do the symptom. So we're playing with a whole cycle. It's broader. You have to think, put it this way, the lower differentiation, the more you got to see, right? And so with protection, usually what you play with is family myths. Family myths means a whole saga about how when we came to Israel, they did this to us, and they did this to us, and then this one did that, and that one did that, and then we froze. We're still doing that. So it's a family myth, and if you can't understand the saga, you won't be able to protect them. You say, well, this is very important. It's 80 years old, and it's not synchronized with what's going on right now, but it's probably more important than time. This is very, very important, this story. And the family feels more like heroes. They feel like, you know, somebody's understood the saga. You become Homer to their war or their way home. And if you look at epistemology, and this is the last part that we're talking about here, you see, when the family gives you the role of, we disagree about us, how can you help us, right? Okay, so then what you need to look at is very small. Why? Because the rest they'll do. In other words, you can say, well, let's talk about how you grew up and how you grew up when you were 16 and how you thought about it. And they say to themselves something new, right? Differentiation has gone up. And they say, oh, you're protecting him from that, and you're trying to save him from that. It's personal, isn't it? So maybe we can find a way to work. So how much do you know about the whole family? You don't need it, right? Now, in your training, you're being trained to do a genogram, right? But if you look at how you use the genogram, you'll see that with the higher differentiation families, you don't need to look at the whole genogram. It's just not necessary. It's possible to do some changes, and all the other changes will happen without you. Thank you very much. When you are the educator or the mover of chairs, the director, you need to see a bit broader. You need to look at epistemology is what you need to know, right? And how you know what you know. So you need to look at in the room who talks to who doesn't talk to who. That's usually a group of about 4 or 5 people. So looking at who talks to who and how it looks, well, that's not in the genogram actually. You'll see it in the room. But you can't afford not to see that because that's your material. So you're looking at interactional cycles now, right? When you are asked to stop the kid from bedwetting now, tell me what to do. So you see that you have to look at the broader picture. You have to say, well, this is a symptomatic cycle. So it's between some people. It works probably over, there may be a central triangle, which is already an abstraction, but how does it work there and who else is involved? And you remember the family that I gave you that actually the grandparents are involved as well, the siblings. So to be an expert, you need to see more, which means you need to ask the family circular questions. You need to ask them how it works. They won't tell you, they don't know. But if you ask the circular questions, you'll get the information that you need. So the paradox is that the more that they want you to be an expert, the more time you need to understand. So you can get out, become curious and have a hypothesis about how they... Now, what do you do when they say, but we didn't come here for you to explore. We're not up here. You're not here in exploration. Well, why are you asking all these questions? And you say, in my role as an expert, these are the things that I need to know in order to give you an expert opinion. No, Milton Erickson needed a split second. That's Milton Erickson. Most of us mortals need time. We need a couple of sessions. And all the time they were asking these questions, and the family said, but we want an answer. I said, I might give you the wrong answer if I don't understand well enough. Just tell me again about your great uncle. You're thinking out loud with them, but you justify it not because you need it, because I need it. You've given me the role as an expert, these are the things I need to know. And finally, when you're doing protection, you don't do it in the first session. That was an American mistake. When an Italian school came over to America, it became a system. All families come in, no matter what the symptom is, you say you probably need to do that. That's where it died, right? Because, why would you say that to somebody who can work with you? Why would you say that to somebody who can give you a role to change things in the room? Why would you say that to people who are asking for an expert opinion? But people who don't give you any of these other roles, then you need, that's where the neutrality comes in, you need to understand them deeply. You need to understand several generations, and you need to understand the family myth. You need an epistemology that's very broad. So as differentiation goes down, our role requires a broader epistemology in order to be able to understand anything that could be useful. The idea of just, saying, okay, don't change when you haven't understood them and they haven't felt understood is an American monster, and that killed this whole approach. And then as that was dying, so-called narrative therapy came about. Some of you have learned, some of you haven't. And narrative therapy essentially replaced everything that was good in this, but guess what? Narrative therapy is used mainly as a way of exploring for people who give you the role anyway. So it's an additional way to do what's easy, but not an additional way to do what's hard. This is what's hard, and these two things we'll talk about in your last semester and trying to learn how exactly to do it. Now, what we want to do is be able to identify, so you'll take these slides that you have and talk to each other for a good time now, maybe until about 20 on, you have 40 minutes, and so try to tell each other about one client where you got lost, maybe they didn't come back, And you said, now you say to yourself, I have a few tools to try to understand what happened. Let me try to understand how I was inducted into the system, what role I thought I had, what role they might have been giving me, and how I might have conducted myself in a different way according to the roles that are possible. That's your role now. My role is to send you off to do it.
There's not so many people here today. I just wonder if everybody could stay here and just work in pairs.
We don't need the other room.
Is that okay?
You're confused.
Less confused.
If you're not, well, less confused, that's not good. You need to be protected to stay confused. What we started to do is something that is, I was speaking to Dina about it as you were working. In some ways, I think it's awfully important for you when you see clients and it doesn't work to be able to think it through. Because you know, if you don't think it through, you know what it is. You know, it's some other therapist would have, and some of the times that may be true. That's true for all of us. But a lot of the times, it's because you're not yet trained to do what the client needs. And there's a serious problem with training, which is that all of training in every form of psychotherapy that I know over the last 40 years that I've been following it, people love to be here. They love to be in higher differentiation, where they get a role and they can do intersubjective work, and it works, right? And so, as we say, sababa, that's, we're in good shape, and you say to yourself, I'm a good therapist, and the client even says to you, you're a good therapist. What they mean is, you've done what I needed. I gave you a role, you took the role that I needed, and you did it fine. That's great. And sometimes it's not easy going, but you did it fine. As you go down the differentiation, that's the arrow of differentiation, as you go down the differentiation level, you see that you end up needing to do more regulation, and the intersubjective part is harder to come to. So then you say to yourself, maybe what I'm trying to do is not what this client needs. So if you can say to yourself about some of the clients who have disappeared on us, and say you said this didn't work, you can always learn more about yourself. We always want to do that. In addition, if we put wheels under it and say what else might we be able to learn, would it be possible to think through that client if I knew how to do something that was appropriate for a lower level of differentiation, something more expert, something that looks at circularity, something that sees the whole myth, and didn't push them to change. Either figured out how to do the role of being an expert, and then the symptom would create the change, not the therapist. The symptom. The symptom's ready, perched to make a change. You just need to free it. That's the work with symptoms. Or they needed me to accept that they need protection, and by the way that I was doing protection, which means seeing things in a different way and engaging in a deep understanding, there's a whole debate about whether it's the process or the content. And, you know, those debates are moot. It's both, right? Some of the times you're telling the clients don't change, but the way you're telling them not to change is by saying, I need to understand you folks a lot more. And they go ahead and change because you've gone through this understanding. You know, when you're deeply understanding the adolescent, and you tell the parents, we're doing this as part of deeply understanding everybody, and it's not to push you to change. He knows what he wants you to do. We don't know that. We just want to deeply understand him. So the parents have a different experience in the room, right? That they're not forced to do anything, but they're able to understand the pain of their child, and the child the pain of their parents, and so forth. So something goes on in the room when you're not pushing. This is the room, you know, of lower differentiation. And in that room, if you accept the role that they give you, things start to change. This is sort of the summary of a year of work in this course. And, you know, we've had a problem with the internet, which I hope, you know, we all make this tefillah every morning that the website should be back up and fixed. And so hopefully the website will be back up and fixed soon. all of the videos are ready to be put on the website, but there hasn't been a website. So you should be able to get them. This and the previous lecture are ones that you might want to go over in your, one of the reasons we do the videos is that we want you to be able to say, I didn't get that, and then say, that's his problem. You can do that, it is my problem. Or you can say, what could I do about it? It's right there, I can do it slow motion, I can take it slowly, I can write down what I didn't understand. And so this is the kind of information that, it's a very complex way of thinking, you know, that's why it's sort of unusual. And so, you know, make use of it. What do you guys have to say? What's your confusion? Yeah?
I really have to say that I love the class.
Say that again?
I love the class and last class because I feel like it puts into words and like understanding a lot of what I've been feeling with clients. Like, you know, feeling that I can't get anywhere with a client or that a client leaves me to be directed. I'm like, where do I put myself?
Okay.
And I feel like the idea of understanding that there are just different types of clients and different roles that they give is
Okay. So that's very important. We have to admit that, you know, you people who are in supervision, what I'm telling you is not what all family therapists think. As far as I know, it's what only one family therapist thinks. It's the future, but it's not there yet. So you may find that the supervision that you get is different, and you know, accept that as sort of a different way of understanding things. This is not the last word of anything. But over time, I assume that as an organization, we'll start to be using this way of thinking more, but we're not there yet. Because these folks here, with the low differentiation, who need us the most, are the least well served. All clinics, practically all clinics, and practically all training is based on how to do this better. And there's like a million different ways to do this better, and it's important to learn them, and that's terrific. But how to do the other part is not on anybody's radar. But it's in your gut when people come in and need to give you a different role.
Yeah, MFT and MFT and Imago and all those other things are for higher differentiation.
Yes, I believe so. If you, I mean, you know, those of you who have taken different forms of training, and then ask yourself, you know, what is the intersubjective expectation of the client? What role do you think the client has to give you in order to do that? Let's say IFS. Well, you got to be pretty good at intersubjective work to be able to do that. And I think that's a problem. If you even look at CBT, there's a certain role that's being given, right? And what do you expect of the client to be able to work in CBT? And CBT, continuing the long tradition of Freud, although they think that they're a completely different tradition, say not everybody can be helped by CBT, right? Not everybody helped. Freud thought that psychoanalysis was 5% of the population. So, you know, there's other ways of doing psychoanalysis, but what really gets to the lowest level of differentiation? It's a good question. In every system, it's a good question, and it tends to be lost because people really want to do what's easier for them, what speaks to us, what moves us, what gives us the kind of role that we became therapists for. Nobody became a therapist to sit with a totally crazy family and tell them they shouldn't change. I don't know anybody who became a therapist. The people in Milano were psychoanalysts for 30 years before they started to do it. And it was very hard for them, and they worked in a group of 4. David, you had a question?
Two things that crossed my mind. One is that I feel that when we get trained in our base training, it's sort of being trained to be a guide. And then we have, I think where this was very helpful is learning that we have to fit in other pieces as well. But that seems to be the base.
Absolutely, right. In other words,
training.
Okay, and you had another part.
The other thing I was saying is that sometimes the clients will come in looking, let's say, for answers. And I think being able to recognize that none of these 4 sometimes will answer them because they're either they're asking for something that you can't give them or something like that. Is sometimes we have clients that they'll walk out after a few sessions because their expectations are unreasonable. What they expected from their therapist was not really any of these things, it was God.
Right. So the further we can go towards, see, what's the last result? Untreatable, right? That's a word that we want to limit to the absolute minimum. That's our responsibility. Are there some people that are untreatable? Sure. Are there some people that are untreatable now and it may be, later? Sure. But from my point of view as a therapist, I want to limit that as much as possible. So when I say to myself, they wanted advice, did I know how to give advice? Did I know how to make a central triangle of a symptom into something that I could tell them, do this, do this, do this, but it's not linear, right? In other words, the average person comes in and says, give me advice, and then you say to them, and what advice would you like to have? They all know it, that's well induction into the system, Give me advice that I need to be have more authority with my kid. Maybe, but where does the authority fit? And so some people come in and say, look, tell me to have more authority, and I'll lock the kid in the room, and he'll come out whimper, and everything will be fine. Okay, that's the Chaim Omer's approach of the parental authority. Does it work for everybody? I don't think so. And it's also not all that playful, which means that you're getting to be less differentiated yourself. But if you can say, I wonder if, instead of saying they're not treatable, say to yourself, afterwards, in a dream, I wonder if I had looked at the central triangle, maybe I was missing something, maybe I wasn't able to say in my role as an expert, there's a difference between how soon you need the advice and how soon I feel that I can competently give you the advice. These are the things that I need to know to be your expert. I'm trying to be your expert, but I need to know some more stuff, which means looking epistemologically more broadly and more deeply, and also talking with people a little more, connecting with them. And it's probably a good idea that a therapy ends with a therapist saying something curious, right? When a client leaves and you're not curious, you're not going to become a better therapist from that. Maybe you won't become worse, but you won't become better from it. If a client leaves and you have some curiosity, and this is a pretty complicated way of looking at curiosity, then hopefully that allows you to wonder what you're missing, what other ways might have been effective. See, nobody has all the tools. This isn't all the tools. This is a map where you can put all the tools in, but this isn't all the tools. So one last question, and then we'll give you some time.
One of the questions and comments is I also really like the frame of thinking and help put in words what's going on that you can't word.
Yeah.
And it would have been helpful. I would have liked supervision, it's a different language. So you were saying that when we'll eventually, it would have been nice to translate this, be able to do it. But
Well, hang around, because we're going to spend the whole semester talking about how to do this. But what David said is right. You have to learn the guide. That's how you learn to be a therapist. And the person who directs the stage, that's how you learn to be a better therapist. Those are the basic tools. Clients who fit that, that's fine. That's how you become a therapist. When you're more certain about that, then you can start to say, what else might I be doing? And then find somebody who teaches it. Okay, we're going to give people a break so they can be fresh for the next class.